Hey, Ray here. I'm back at it again with another video, but today we're talking about something a little bit different. I want to talk about a set, one of the many GX sets, that a lot of people overlook. They disregard it as a bad set, but I think that's kind of like a collective thing that people have started to have the opinion on looking back at Yu-Gi-Oh! History. A lot of people say, the GX era was awful, half the sets were garbage, and they'll name sets like Cyberdark Impact as an example. But if you look at some of these sets, they were really good. And one of the sets that I propose we should take a really hard look at is Strike of Neos. I feel like this set is a lot better than a lot of people remember it being. It introduced so many cool things into the game, but it's one of those sets that everyone seems to forget about because, especially when you come to things like progression series type historical lookbacks, just because the stuff in there isn't necessarily great for sealed, doesn't mean that there wasn't a great set in general. Now, let's look at some of the important cards it introduced. In terms of generic cards, Neo-Spacian Grand Mole was so good it eventually got limited. Grand Mole, for those of you who don't know, essentially you can use it as a semi-removal tool that whenever you attack something, you return both it and that to the hand. While this might not have been super relevant initially, especially with the rise of Synchros, you can return them to the extra deck with Neo-Spacian Grand Mole, which made it a very powerful removal tool. So this card was a very relevant release. DD Crow was arguably one of the first meta-relevant hand traps. DD Crow would go on to be run in sideboards everywhere and still sees some play today. So, you know, the impact of this card can't be understated either. A little interesting note about power creep: Gene Warped Warwolf and Frostosaurus were printed in this set. Gene Warped Warwolf is the first normal summonable 2000 attack vanilla that does not require a tribute. That's it's pretty crazy. To think all the way back in Legend of Blue Eyes, you needed to tribute for a Curse of Dragon just to reach 2000 attack. How times had changed. Frostosaurus powercraft the ever-present Summoned Skull by having 100 more attack, which I know might not seem significant, but there is actually logic behind printing these power creep cards in this set, and that's because this set contained Ancient Rules, which lets you special summon vanillas that are level 5 or higher from your hand. This is very important as it formed the basis of normal monster beatdown, and combined with cards like Just a Break that would eventually release, you have the shell for a legitimate beatdown deck, and one that is in relatively low rarity, which, well, although these cards would not be in low rarity, they would be reprinted into the ground later. But you could see what they were going for here. And on top of that, you could pivot this normal monster deck into a ritual normal monster deck, thanks to advanced ritual art, which, before it was abused by Demise OTK, was intended to be used with two very specific rituals. Because it lets you tribute normal monsters from your deck instead of from your hand or field, it was an extremely powerful ritual spell, and it could be used with any ritual monster. So it was very versatile as well, but there were two it was meant to be used with. Lycanthrope, which when it deals battle damage to your opponent, inflicts 200 damage for each normal monster in your graveyard, which naturally you would be either sent from just normal summoning and beating down with them, or alternatively through advanced ritual art. Kukulane is similar. By removing from play or banishing one normal monster from your graveyard, it gains attack equal to that normal monster's attack until the standby phase of your next turn. So importantly, it does it during your opponent's turn as well. So the idea probably was that you would banish something like a Frostosaurus from your grave to get a big powered up Kukulane, and you would beat down your opponent. And you would use Advanced Ritual Art as a way to get more normal monsters in there to feed also your Lycanthrope. So, you know, there was a really interesting deck that they had basically created the foundation for here just in this set, but it's one of those things that people don't talk about because, again, people don't really look back on these old sets very fondly, and I don't entirely understand why. Another really obviously notable thing is the inclusion of the Six Samurai. This was, I believe, the debut set of the Six Samurai, and we got Grandmaster, which I don't think I need to explain how powerful this was. This was a normal summonable, a special summonable 2100 beta, so it was kind of like an archetypal Cyber Dragon that required you to have a monster instead. And obviously you got some of the base Six Samurai: Kamon, Yoriza, Nisashi. Zanji and Iro are the noble ones here, I'd say, because Zanji is an 1800 normal summonable body, which for the time was very high. The only other normal summonable or high attack monsters usually were 1900, but that was pushing it, usually. Ero deals with a lot of annoying set cards, and obviously you got Great Shogun Shien, which for the time was a really powerful boss monster. They had a floater in the form of Shien's Foot Soldier. There was really a solid basis for Six Samurai here. They also had quite a few of their traps, so that's pretty notable. You have Dark World here getting a lot of its a wave of support, which was, again, really interesting. People often will say things about older sets like, oh, old Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't have archetypes, they didn't really think about card design, but again, if you just sit down and even look at one of these old sets, you can see they release wave of supports for old archetypes, they introduce new archetypes, they power creep some things, they give players new things to work with. It's just that, again, nobody really sits down and looks at these sets, I feel, so they forget, you know, what's so good about them. Often they would print cards that were very clearly intended just for the side deck. Puppet Plant and Electric Virus are very obviously intended to be side deck cards here, because obviously Puppet Plant is specifically against Warrior and Spellcasters, and Electric Virus is against Machine and Dragon. Why those tribes specifically? It's because they were probably pretty powerful at the time, so they thought, hey, let's print some interesting side deck cards for players to make use of. DD Crow was probably the same thing. It was clearly a side deck card. Except I have a feeling it wasn't exactly for the type of decks that, you know, you would imagine it being played against now. Here's another interesting thing. Here we have a cycle. A thing a lot of older Yu-Gi-Oh! Sets will print consistently is cycles for all the elements, because they still cared about elements here. Thinking of Cyber Dark Impact, they have the barrier statues, which is one in every element, right? This is a series of level 7s that when they're destroyed, they specifically take out a everything but one type of monster, right? So it's clear that these were printed as support for decks that were still clinging on to the, oh, this is a fire deck, this is an earth deck. Because there was enough support at this point that you could still attempt to build those types of decks. Like Gaia Power Beatdown was not exactly a meta deck at this time, but you could totally try and make it work. And it's clear that they were trying to support them with decks like these and the barrier statues and other such things. Again, there was more elemental hero support. Now, I'm not going to try and defend these as being great or anything, but obviously for a lot of fans of the anime, they have to kind of print these cards at a high rarity just to add collectible value to the sets, right? For a lot of people, what were they looking for in these GX sets? They were looking for the cool hero cards, right? So all of these Neo-Spacians, although they were never meta relevant in any way, you know, they worked. And they were cool and they were fancy, and if you could get them off, you would probably feel great. Now, Dark World dealings, that's just more Dark World support, which was, again, they were given more support in this set. There was more, obviously, Neo stuff, because this was the introduction of a lot of Neo-Spacians, more Six Samurai stuff. This was Alien support, since Aliens were released earlier. This is a generic quick play. It's more of a side deck card twister, since it only targets face-up speller traps. But it's, again, you can see what they were doing here. Most sets they'd have a few archetypes, legacy support, and a couple generic cards that you could just throw in your deck. And it's like, yeah, there was a lot of thought that clearly went into designing these sets. But again, people completely dismiss them because they think of them as like low power sets just because everything in them didn't immediately go into the meta. Now, I think they thought Card Trader was better than it was because it took up a super rare slot. Yeah, I will admit, they did occasionally make oopsies and think that cards were good when they were not, but hey. We also got Big C, yeah, which was obviously more hero support. Heroes were always getting support because obviously them being an anime archetype that was well beloved by the casual fan base, there was the demand for more support and there was more support being shown in the anime anyway, so makes sense here. I think that's about it. There's a couple more cards that are very clearly side deck cards. Ritual Sealing is probably because they were scared that Advanced Ritual Art might make ritual decks too powerful, so they're like, hey, here's a side deck card. Same with Anti-Fusion Device. Oh, fusions might be too powerful? Here, take a side deck card. Birthright further supports Frostosaurus, Gene Warp, Warwolf, and the general normal monster theme of this set. Pulling the Rug is against monarchs. I'm going to be real. I can't think of what else would be. And there's also a whole archetype here in terms of fairies that sing. It all goes well with Sanctuary in the Sky decks, which were very early fairy control decks, but with this wave of support, they suddenly became a lot more viable. Nova Summoner and Gelen Duo would see use all the way up to Edison in terms of fairies, so the cards here were very, very relevant. See, a lot of these though do require Sanctuary in the Sky on the field, because eventually fairies started with Sanctuary of the Sky, but they eventually kind of moved on to Valhalla and using basically being how fast can we get out Christia, and slowly control our opponent's plays with the Heralds. And then Herald of Perfection got printed, and that became its own deck, but that's for another time. Anyway, I hope this has made you guys reconsider Strike of Neos, and maybe even got you guys to think about some of the other GX sets that you guys might have thought were bad, but you know, there was a lot of thought that went behind them and a lot of interesting cards that got printed. If you guys have any other sets you'd like me to cover and explain why they weren't as bad as you remember, let me know down in the comments, and have a good one.